Recreation and Neighborhood to order. Mr. Zine is currently at the Audits Committee, and Ms. Perry will not be present today, so we'll move on the two items that are on the agenda. Before we get started with item one, we have three cards. I ask you to come at this time, Mr. Bailey, Charlene Davis, and Leonard Schaefer. 2 minutes. We have Charlene Davis and also Leonard Schaefer.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chairman Parks. Glenn Bailey, member of the Encino Neighborhood Council, speaking as an individual. However, I am reflecting on a statement that will be submitted to the record. I have an electronic copy, but I don't have a hard copy of a statement from the Los Angeles Neighborhood Council Coalition, which, to paraphrase, basically points out that neighborhood councils have been cut by 25% over the last several years in its annual budget. And also to bring to your attention that many of them have encumbered money specifically for the upcoming elections to the tune of over $200 and some thousand. You'll get that exact number, I'm sure, shortly. And that the Los Angeles Neighborhood Council Coalition opposes any more monies taken from its fiscal year money from 2012-2013. That's basically a summary of their statement, and I will get to the legislative assistant the actual email from the chair of LANC.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, Councilmember Parks. Carlene Davis, South Los Angeles representative to the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners, as well as the Vice President of the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. At the last meeting of the board, we took an official position against any further cuts to the neighborhood council system. Already, the system has experienced a series of cuts. There was a nearly 8% cut to individual NCs for the upcoming year, as well as a 50% cut to funding the election process. And so any further cuts to the NCs would be detrimental to their ongoing work and to the work that many councils are engaging in around elections. And also, I'm not sure if you are aware, but there are a number of neighborhood councils who've also already encumbered funds for outreach and for the elections. And so I just wanted to reiterate the Commission's position that we are opposed to any further cuts to the NC system and to the individual NCs for this upcoming fiscal year.
Let me ask you, did your organization or group of organizations participate in the survey regarding elections that the city clerk participated in recently?
The Board of Neighborhood Commissioners, I'm representing the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners.
I understand, but did you see the survey that was done by the city clerk?
Around the election?
Yes.
A while back?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And I just want to know if you're familiar with what they came out in the survey.
Yes, we discussed well, I'm not sure which report.
You were talking about the issue.
A number of reports from.
Okay. The issue I was referring to was the subject you were talking about on funding the elections.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with what the survey came up with?
I can't recall the specific points now, but we've looked at all of, as the commission, we've looked at all the reports. If there's a particular point that you're referencing.
Let me find it.
Okay.
For you.
Do you have a copy?
Of the most recent report? No. Sure. No way. Some of them did. Right, but that's voluntary. Okay.
I'll find it before the
Okay.
meeting's over, but basically it identifies that a fairly decent percentage of those surveyed commented that they would be willing to pay a portion, and I think something like 20-some% even said they'd pay it all. I just wondered if you were aware of what that survey.
Right, and so there is definitely diversity across the system, and so but I think all neighborhood councils are committed to this election process, but also committed to having the autonomy to decide how best to utilize their funds. So yes, there are neighborhood councils who've had the ability. There are other neighborhood councils who've already had other priority projects as well. So I think it is a wonderful indication of the support of the system that many neighborhood councils are willing to encumber more of their funds to the elections, but recognizing that there are also other valuable projects the neighborhood councils are working on as well.
Of those, I think it was, first of all, starting off with 62 of the 95 neighborhood councils participated in the survey, just right at 65%. Of those that participated, nearly 76% were willing to contribute a limited amount of funds towards the cost election, 21% of those who considered covering the full cost. But
I don't think that there's disagreement.
No, I'm not disagreeing. I'm
Right.
just saying where that issue came from. Okay. All right. Thank you. Mr. Schaefer.
Good afternoon, Councilmember Parks. Leonard Schaefer, representing the South Valley neighborhood councils on the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners, and I concur in what my fellow commissioner had to say with regards to our action. I would point out that the study that you've looked at, two things. One, it was not 100%, although we rarely get 100%. But number two, there were no costs involved. There were never any costs cited by the clerk's office, so everybody that was making comments was shooting blind because they had no idea what the cost of elections would be. Next, the neighborhood councils.
I think 60-some% of the people complied on the survey. The 30% that chose not to comply, I don't know if we can now interject them in the discussion.
No, but what I'm
That's what we're going by, those that participated.
But what I'm saying is there were no cost analysis, no figures in that survey.
I know, but that's why item 1 is on the calendar today, asking the CAO and the CLA to give us some ideas.
And if I may, in the past, now I will be speaking with my other hat on, and that is as a neighborhood council member. Neighborhood councils have traditionally paid for outreach and various other things. And I think that very seriously that within the survey, many of the neighborhood councils that were responding were actually saying, we've done it before, we'll do it again. As chair of the Tarzana Neighborhood Council, I know that our council has set aside up to $8,000 of whatever may be left from our budget this year to use for outreach and other election expenses. So as a neighborhood council member, and speaking strictly for myself as a neighborhood council member, and one who's participated in neighborhood councils since more or less their beginning, I would say that any further expenditures other than those planned by neighborhood councils already should not be forced upon them. In the same way that we wouldn't expect, if I may, with no disrespect, say that council members should have their individual funds docked when they themselves run for re-election and perhaps get public funds. Instead of the funds coming from public contributions, they should come from the office holder accounts. That would be saying very much the same thing.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Wiseman, on item 1, and while you're there, you can also make your public comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We missed your colleagues.
Earlier, we said Mr. Zine is chairing the audit committee and Ms. Perry's unavailable.
And I'm very anxious to get into that audit committee meeting too, so that be that. The issue here is whether a council has already made preparations or not. My particular council is ready to have a election process, I guess we'd call it a selection, in the month of May, and had put aside funds. We took those funds and encumbered them so that they could be part of the process, which will be done in this formal city activity. But I was opposed to doing that because I thought we should go ahead with our elections and not wait for the city's help to do so. I think many councils are in that position. You've already heard that many councils have already encumbered funds. I would criticize the survey that you have been quoting because that survey was done for the purposes of and was prepared by the city clerk. And with all respect to anybody who puts out a survey, and I put out probably as many as anybody in this room, they invariably meet the needs of the surveyor. That being the case, fine, that survey was to endorse and approve the city clerk's continued activity, but that has been set aside. And now we're in the process of trying to see if the $600 and some odd thousand and the resources of done will be able to do what the city clerk didn't do, especially in regard to outreach. Outreach is a terribly difficult problem, and that's the subject of the public comment that I would like to follow these comments with. Thank you.
Thank you. Go to public comment?
Yes, sir. First of all, I greatly appreciate the opportunity for public comment in this meeting, especially since we haven't had many regular meetings. You've held a number of special meetings out in the communities from taking your office, which we all appreciate. But a few weeks ago, you came forth with a council file amendment, Amendment 10-1797-S7, which was a request for the neighborhood councils to explain how they react to major issues. And this was an amendment to a major issue. I don't even need to talk about what the major issue was, because what happened was this was taken to the LA Neighborhood Council Coalition, and a motion was made, a copy of which I've presented to you and your committee, and a number of comments were made. Number one, some of my colleagues thought that this was a criticism of neighborhood councils. And I accept it as being a criticism of neighborhood councils, but not a defamatory or a degradation of the neighborhood councils. Outreach for us is a very difficult process. But I view this amendment that you put forward, and I think many of us do, as an opportunity to, first of all, define the major issues, to work with our city council members, with our mayor, and with the decision makers of this city to identify and then have the neighborhood councils have adequate time to respond to and tell the decision makers how they view these various major issue proposals. To that extent, I am, and a number of my colleagues are beginning to put forward some activities which will be able to do that. I encourage the participation of everyone in this room, and I welcome the advice that you have already given me on the matter, and hope that this will be the beginning of something really very important for our neighborhood councils. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Let me just say, we've seen a number of people that have speculated what the motion means. And just to let you know what the motion means is we're listening to neighborhood councils who say that many major issues get by them. And here's one that may be as major as you can have it, and that is talking about identifying 11 shed locations throughout the city and to change dramatically the way that commercial and larger residential properties trash is picked up. So we thought that we would put something together where you would not have to basically go to the policy committee and be held to their agenda, but actually be able to research this as neighborhood councils come back with insight as to the impact on your community. So there was nothing sinister about it. It was a matter of getting an item that we thought was important, that we heard from neighborhood councils, and we're going to do that in the future when there are major issues that affect Citywide, that will bring them before the committee.
If I may respond quickly, let us then make the watershed issue the first major issue and see if we can use it as a case in point as to how this can be done. But I am hoping that this will be the first of many major issues, perhaps a methodical way of dealing with major issues. The major issue in question was first proposed in 2010, so it's already been on the books for a year and a half or two. So there's time to use this as a good example, and I think that's a good start.
Well, that's the intent, and also be aware that the way the process is going, there's a 5-year hiatus to alert the community of the proposed change. So it gives a great deal of time for people to have input.
I hope we can do it well. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just comment on just one issue, and although we certainly can dispute about what the intent of the survey, one thing I'd just like to bring out that there was a total of 6 questions, and in reading them, I don't know if we could determine that they were slanted in any way. It appears that if we look at question 1, are you willing to postpone elections until 2014 as determined by the city's 2011-12 budget and administrative code restrictions placed on the city clerk? Answer yes. Skip this question 3. Answer no. Explain. Page number 2, if you would like to hold non-city elections prior to 2014, would you be willing to consider in terms of cost of the election? Please check all that apply. The first box is contribute a limited amount. Second is cover the full amount. Third, utilize the town hall selection process. Item under future neighborhood council elections, would you prefer to administer your elections in the future? Please rank the option. A, your neighborhood council using town hall, city clerk, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, independent election, hybrid, or other. Number 4, what method do you prefer to electing board members? At poll, vote by mail, internet, telephone, or hybrid? And the 5th one, as an alternative to the method above, would you prefer a town hall election or a town hall selection? 2 answers: town hall election, mandatory; secret ballot; town hall selection, open public meeting. And then question 6, please include specific comments that you feel are valuable. I don't know if it could be any more straightforward than those 5 questions. So clearly, I think whether people participate or not is of greater concern as opposed to people being tricked by the questions. Can we bring staff up on item 1?
Item number 1 is a CLA and CAO to report relative to the determination of an appropriate dollar amount for each neighborhood council to contribute toward conducting the 2012 neighborhood council elections in order to relieve the cost and burden on the city pursuant to council action of May 9th, 2012.
Let me just make a general comment. On both these items, today we set up this special meeting with the expectation that we were going to be able to make a decision on item 1 and 2. It doesn't appear on either one of them that we're going to have sufficient information to move them forward. But what we're going to do today is on both of them is get information and testimony and look towards having a meeting, special meeting in July, so that we can approve this, because it's my intent to have these 2 reports finalized before elections start in August. And so the whole intent of item 1 and 2 was to come to some conclusion about these 2 subjects, and particularly item 2 was to have a comprehensive report that every neighborhood council could have access to before elections started, so they would clearly know what the guidelines were. And that's what we will move towards. But we will take testimony today and listen and allow the CLA-CAO to get information so they can come back. But when we have the next meeting, our intent is to approve these 2 items so that they can be in place prior to the August elections. Can we work with that? Can we ask the CLA-CAO?
We're good with that.
With that? Okay. Okay, you can work with Lorenzo on timing. I understand generally because of recess, we don't have a meeting in August, but we'll make whatever we
July.
need to work that out. We'll have a meeting in August as a special meeting around recess so that we can nail these two things down before the elections start.
Yep. Paul Smith, CLA. I think we really want an opportunity to sit down with Dunn staff and look at this issue closer. We have some questions about the responses, the process. We need to have that discussion to get a better grasp of what was the possibilities here.
No, I agree, and I think the issue that I got concerned about when I read the material is that your list of questions and answers was almost as in-depth as the Dunn report, which I think they should be merged so that people aren't finding pieces of paper and things like that. We should have a comprehensive report that every neighborhood council has and says, this is what we're going to do in elections for 2012.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so why don't you give us an overview on item 1?
Item 1, Mr. Chairman, is actually a request previously made by council for the CAO and the CLA to come back and look at a cost-sharing mechanism that NCs could contribute or pay a portion of the election fee, election costs. The department has prepared 2 reports. A most recent one was a supplemental report, which answered a series of questions that were posed by COCLA staff to get a better glimpse into the process. More importantly, the plan that's will be put into effect, and that expenditures attached to each one of those, and some explanation of how that's going to work, and the rationale behind each one of those expenditure items in terms of how they came up with the associated costs. They have produced 2 reports, but we think we need to sit down with them and have some more in-depth discussions about where they got their numbers, how those numbers were derived, are some of the cost categories the best way to approach this. So it's just a matter of having an opportunity to discuss in full breadth of what we need to come back with.
Okay. The 2 things I'd like you to consider is on dealing with the election or selection. I would think, not having participated in either one, I would think one would be less costly than the other, and so that there should be some consideration of when you assess it as to the cost, be a differential. And the other issue I think is relevant on as far as the elections as we move forward, that we consider those neighborhood councils that have discussed that they have put money aside already for this eventuality, and just how that impacts a future contribution. Does it come from what they've set aside? Does it come from the 12-13 allocation? I think those are the kinds of things that need to be thought out.
Yeah, we are of the understanding that a number of the NCs have set aside through the encumbrance process established by Dunn to pay for certain outreach costs. Not necessarily the election themselves, but those costs, those activities necessary to give the community the information about here we are, we're having an election, please participate, this is the date. And essentially have a better idea from the department what types of activities that entails, and the number of NCs that actually have made those encumbrances, and the costs and the money set aside, what's the average, what would be used for.
Yeah. No, I think we need all of that, and again, and I think part of this, if we understand some of the comments that were made on some of the general meetings we attended, is that outreach seems to be an area that's been very limited, to the point that people complain about, number one, not knowing about neighborhood councils, even though they've been around for a decade, or that there is no understanding as to when the meetings are held or when the elections are held. And each one of those, I think, falls right back into the grievance process, that people believe that it's a closed shop And so therefore, if you don't invite everybody, then you keep electing the same people. And so I think we can do the best we can, and it is a very expensive part of the process is the outreach. And one of the things we intend to do when we get beyond the elections, our next challenge, as we talked about in meetings, was to deal with this whole concept of the budget and what that budget, maybe some priorities of how the budget should be spent and things like that. And part of it should be outreach. It should be a major part of how that annual budget should be expended. And we gave some criteria last time about whether people are in good standing, those kind of things as to every year, so that we're not going through kind of a haphazard issue. And I think what I've seen on this is that although there is a tendency or a concern about total independence, yet there's also just as much of a reliance on city processes that we have to be able to validate the use of 50,000 or 40,000 or whatever it is this year. And we can't just say, here's the money, and there is no control, because we've seen enough cases come back where people have been prosecuted or nearly prosecuted for misappropriation. So I think there's a balance between being totally independent and also being aware that there is a requirement by city procedures that certain things occur, whether it's Brown Act or how we conduct ourselves financially. But I think one of the things that I'd like to come out of the discussion with the finances eventually is to give some criteria or some guidance as to what are some of the viable ways of money being used, so that we don't hear the criticism that people are saying, well, the world's coming to an end, and yet we're funding T-shirts, or we're funding the tile in a police department roll call room, and just exactly, is it supposed to be for beautification? Is it for the enhancement of the community? Or is it just willy-nilly, whatever you get so many votes on? So
Yeah, I think our observation from the last election cycle was that the sense was the outreach portion of it was totally underfunded, and there was an incomplete reach to the community to have them support the NCs and the election process. And I think the NCs are cognizant of the fact that they do not want that to be repeated again. So some of them who did have money put some money aside to go and have a robust outreach for NC officers.
And I think one of the big surprises for me when we had our around the city meetings is that to find out, not just in one part of the city, but kind of universally, that the monthly or bi-monthly or whatever the schedule of meetings, that in many instances the only people there were the board members. And so that was mind-boggling to me. I did not know that was a trend, that board members attend and the general community was not a part of those neighborhood council meetings. And so, again, that's something that not only for elections, but ongoing meetings have to have outreach.
Okay. We'll come back to you.
All right, thank you for that. So we'll get that and hope that in July we'll be able to address that item 1. Go to item 2. We have.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Item number 2 is a Dunn report relative to its implementation and expenditure plan for to conduct the 2012 neighborhood council elections, and details as to the number of neighborhood councils that will have elections, the method of elections, and the department's plan to conduct the elections and expend funds authorized in the department's fiscal year 2012-13 proposed budget for the elections.
Okay. Let me just ask, can we just get one seat and get 2 people up here, and then we can come back with staff? Dr. Wiseman and Glenn Bailey on item 2.
Could I follow the staff?
Pardon?
Maybe we do the staff presentation first, so we can respond to it?
Well, I'd kind of like to have you speak so they can respond to you. If you find that we've not covered something, wave your hand and we'll make some accommodations.
All right, thank you. Glenn Bailey again, speaking as an individual. I think my overall concern is that, you know, this was on again, off again, on again type of a situation that has put Dunn in a very difficult, not just Dunn, but the neighborhood councils in a difficult situation. I think Dunn has presented a detailed report plan, but I think part of the concern that we're looking at now is not only we have a short time frame, we're also looking at possibly changing the rules of the game midstream. You would never do that in a football game after the second quarter. And that's,
What are the rules you think are changed?
well, I don't know. I mean, you've got a motion with regards to the funding issue, and people already have deadlines for submitting a budget to the city, not knowing what the outcome of this is going to be. That'll fundamentally affect that. And yet, you know, I hope one of the questions you'll ask is how many of the neighborhood councils actually have put out money, and how much money have they put out for the outreach effort. And that clearly, in my opinion, because I went to the various meetings the city clerk held, that was the discussion that that the neighborhood councils seemed to have when they were talking about putting money forward, contributing money to the election process. It wasn't contributing money to the city clerk or contributing money to whomever was running the elections. It was for the missing component from the prior election, which was no funded outreach. So it may not have been explicitly stated that way in the survey, but it was very clear at the time because we'd just gotten off that whole process. So I guess the concern is the first round of elections are on August 4th. Candidate filing started last Monday. The deadline for vote by mail is on, and candidate filing is on July 5th for that Region 1. And then shortly thereafter, the following regions. So I think it's really, this conversation really should be, in my opinion, should be focused more on 2014, unless you can figure out a way to actually improve things. But I think raising more questions at this point, when we're already trying to get people all on board, is really making things more challenging. But I would like to hear what, you know, the dialogue with the department. Thank you.
And then we have Dr. Weissman. Yeah. Okay, and Nina, is it Royale?
Good afternoon.
Hi there.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Nina Royal, and I'm from Sunland, Tahunga, and I'm going to speak to you on a personal basis. As you know, I'm a reporter, and I have a newspaper. And one of the things that's out there regarding neighborhood councils is that the city is not friendly to them. And if you are going to be cutting their money and taking their funds to put into an election, when most of the neighborhood councils that I have talked to have already set aside money for their elections and feel that they have done a better job than what the city clerk did, and for a lot less money. So I'm thinking that you should really leave the funds alone and let the neighborhood councils work it out. I know my own Region 1 has gotten together and doing outreach together through the Times and the Daily News and other local newspapers, and doing their own outreach. And it's to their benefit that they do this, because then they will be able to do what they were meant to do to begin with, which is be a liaison between the city and the neighborhoods. And by taking more money away from them, not only do you discredit the city and their intent to support neighborhood councils, but you kind of render them ineffective. So I hope that you will give this more consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask you, so you're speaking for yourself or for your neighborhood council?
I speak for myself, but I can tell you that from my experience, this is the attitude that's out there.
Okay. But has the neighborhood council taken a position?
Our neighborhood councils like to keep their own money.
Okay. But I mean, have they taken a position? Have they done anything for them?
Well, I didn't, apparently they didn't get a letter written in time, so I'm not at liberty to say that. I'm sure, personally speaking, that they would have, however, they ran out of time because we have other issues that we're dealing with.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we could have staff come up now. And we could ask the CAO-CLA to come to the table also. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair.
Are you going to be using the June 4th report as the basis of your presentation?
Correct.
Okay, so why don't you give us an overview?
Thank you. Bong Wan Kim, General Manager, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, and I'll provide you an overview of the report that we submitted at the Chairman's request, supplementing our report that we submitted in the May's Education Neighborhoods Committee meeting. And basically, the report format was in a question and response. There were specific questions that were provided by CAO, or CLA, and that we responded to. The first one was, which we combined with 1 and 5, which was the number of NCs that have elections, that will have elections in 2012, including those that will use selection process or will affirm the existing board. How many NCs have full or partial board seats up for election in 2012? The chart lists the data that 80 elections will be held. 49 neighborhood councils will have full board open seats. 31 will have half of the board with open seats. 4 selection processes have been confirmed to date. 4 NCs are still deliberating on whether they'll have a selection process. The board self-affirmation will be determined after a certain deadline, after which we will determine whether any seats are basically uncontested, which will constitute self-affirmation.
Let me ask you, give me a little better definition what that means.
So what we're calling it is when open board seats are uncontested, so there's only one candidate running. And then 3 neighborhood councils will not have elections because they decided to have 4-year terms in the 2010 elections, when the city clerk conducted them. Question number 2 is how many NCs have used the selection process to seat their boards this year? And this was a partial response. Basically, the last fiscal year was the first time that the department administered selection processes, and that was mainly because the city clerk was the only entity authorized to conduct elections. But in this fiscal year, most of the, if not all of the harbor region will be conducting their own selection process. And currently, 1 NC in the harbor has completed a selection process. Question number 3 is a detailed operational plan to conduct neighborhood council elections, enumerating expenditures as authorized in the department's fiscal year 12-13 proposed budget for elections, outreach, supplies, translation services, hiring plans, etc. Our response was basically to reference the elections manual, which was completed and is being widely distributed. And I believe that this constitutes what the chair was referring to as a comprehensive document that outlines all of the policies, the procedures, and the implementation plan for conducting neighborhood council elections.
And that's what we refer to as the manual?
Yes, that's correct, the 2012 election manual. And I must say that this is the first time that the city has ever produced such a comprehensive manual, and the intent is to provide as much consistency and transparency to the conduct of neighborhood council elections. And I'd like to thank Gracie Liu for doing such a great job in making a manual available such as this, which is both comprehensive but yet easy to read. So this will be what guides neighborhood councils as well as the department staff. And if you look through the various pages, it starts out with an overview of what is different from the way the department will administer elections versus the city clerk, an explanation of how elections differ from selections, which is on page 5, the election timeline and description of each of the major phases. It also explains what NC should prepare for in conducting elections, and a description of each of the key milestones leading up to election day.
Let me ask you one, and I hope it's in the right place. We got a call last week on the sense of elections being set. Do we have an issue about elections being set where they conflict with the high holy days or the holy days of,
Yeah.
Did we resolve that?
We did resolve it. We basically shifted those neighborhood councils to another election region.
Okay, any other conflicts like that that we can pick out of the scheduling?
Not to our knowledge, but, basically the process for deciding the regional election, we left to the neighborhood councils. So it wasn't the department's decision. Sometimes, the group reaches a decision where 1 or 2 neighborhood councils have some problems. This is the first time that we've crossed that road, and we said, if this requires you to change your election date, then we can accommodate by moving you to another region. So we've done that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
The following section describes all of the policies related to the elections in terms of term extensions, board affirmation, write-in candidates, shortened or extended election times, vote by mail fees, location fee, election schedule, if there's a deadline or conflict, running board slates, what that looks like, candidate filing form information, and the inspection of forms. And finally, the last section of the manual details all of the major election procedures, pages 13 through 26, including the method of elections, locations, boundaries, definition of stakeholder, the role of the independent election administrator, candidates, candidate and stakeholder verification, campaigning, electioneering, ballots, polling place operations, vote by mail, canvass of votes and certification, challenges, recounts, vacating multiple seats, outreach, translation assistance, exit poll surveys, videotaping, seating of newly elected board members, governing board member seats not filled through elections, release of election materials, Public Records Act, and disposition of elections records. The proposed budget that we submitted to the City Council and which was approved recently included the following line items: a request for 4 exempt project coordinators. And these project coordinators are basically the overall managers, coordinators, and troubleshooters for the overall citywide elections. Their primary role would be to serve as a liaison between neighborhood council election committees, at the neighborhood council level, working with the independent election administrators, as well as coordinating with city entities such as the city attorney and other relevant city departments. There's a lot of administrative work that's involved in administrating elections, basically related to the adjustment of bylaws. Every neighborhood council election has to approve their election procedures, so there's a lot of back and forth involved in that. We'll be managing between 10 and 15 independent election administrators, managing the challenge process. We continually to collaborate with neighborhood councils. We did conduct an elections task force, and at some point we'll be calling back in neighborhood councils to advise us throughout the elections process as to how we're doing and see if we can incorporate the feedback that we get to subsequent elections. They'll also be responsible for coordinating the number of informational and training meetings that we've already conducted and we continue to plan to conduct throughout the city. And lastly, the timing of the hiring of these project coordinators will be very critical, and that's something that I mentioned to City Council when the budget was approved, because with the timeline already being implemented, we cannot afford to go dark in terms of staffing, and the managed hiring committee will be very important in terms of giving a timely decision on the staffing positions. We also included as-needed positions, and this constitutes independent election administrators and clerks and assistant clerks. They will serve as independent, impartial parties to oversee the elections, and we brought on 11 to date. Additional duties include the completion of each election procedure to be approved by the department, the processing of candidates, including verification of the eligibility and conducting candidates forums, processing of voters, including the pre-registration and eligibility, overseeing and approving the voter ballots, distributing and receiving ballots from voters, recounting the ballots, and issuing the election results. As needed, election clerks and assistants will be hired to assist with the day of elections. This is probably the most unpredictable aspect of elections. While past voting records have some indication in terms of what the day of deployment will look like, we'll have to be sure that we have enough bodies, trained bodies, available to be able to respond with sudden, unpredictable large voter turnout. So that's probably that's the need for the flexible workforce in terms of being
And
able
how are
to
we doing? Are we getting volunteers or?
We are using volunteers as well, but we don't want to principally rely on volunteers. They're a backup, and we are certainly encouraging and incorporating as many volunteers at the neighborhood council level as possible to manage various aspects of the elections. Contractual services is constituted by translators and arbiters, the translation of all written materials and interpretation of meetings, And that's further elaborated in a question that's further below. And then professional arbiters to handle the challenge process. And that'll also be elaborated on in a question further on down. We also included in the budget $25,000 for printing and binding, and that's all to print all of the elections materials the manuals, as well as the printing of all the procedures. There'll be outreach flyers, et cetera. Office and admin expense is also $25,000 to help with administrative expenses and equipment, laptops and such. There will be some need for flexibility in terms of the management of the budget line items, because this is the first time that we're running elections in this way. So these were more placeholders as opposed to, we absolutely know that we're going to stick to these line items. Of course, we'll look for every opportunity to save funds whenever possible, but we will need to probably, as we go through the administration of the elections, have to transfer back and forth to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the neighborhood councils appropriately. Question number 4, how is the $120,000 in current funds being used by the department, including itemized categories and amounts? And it's enumerated in the report. Basically, election coordinators, independent election administrators, election support temp staff, office equipment, and ads and outreach for $10,000, which is basically consists of bus bench ads, street banners, and bus kiosk ads.
How are you coordinating that outreach with the individual neighborhood councils and their budgets?
Well, what we have is a citywide advertising strategy. So what we'll do is focus on, say, working with Department of Transportation or Bureau of Sanitation to try to work in getting a larger citywide message. What we've been doing with the regional elections is collaborating with them to focus on how they could spend money. So, for example, in the Valley region, for the first time, all of them have agreed to chip in on full-page ads in the daily news. I didn't bring a copy, but I'll share one with you. And it's a full-page ad, and it'll run concurrently, timed with each of the regions in the Valley. And it's a great message. It basically says, get involved, participate. This is a great opportunity to make a difference in your community. So that's one example of how we're collaborating and partnering with neighborhood councils.
You say DOT, you're looking at the bus bench program?
Correct. And we'll also reaching out to every council office and the mayor's office. You all have your websites, and so as your region comes up for elections, we'll also be asking you to post information on outreach and participation opportunities for the elections. Question number 6, how many IEAs are needed, job description, and what are the range of costs? Please provide selection criteria and outreach. We have currently staffed up to 11 IEAs. They'll be paid a fixed fee of $800 per election, plus a $10 additional administrative charge that our current temporary staffing vendors charge. Their responsibilities are enumerated in the report, but briefly summarizing, they'll be conducting all of the elections, including processing the stipulation worksheets and other applicable legal documents. They'll be processing the candidates. They'll be assisting the regions with any candidate information sessions. They'll be processing voters, including pre-reg, verification of eligibility, overseeing and approving the preparation of the ballots, distributing and receiving ballots, verifying and any provisional ballots, counting and recounting the ballots, issuing the election results, and then securing and submitting all election materials for records retention.
Let me just ask, maybe I was confused when this came up before. These individuals that we're talking about, paid positions, are individuals that could be neighborhood council members in other areas?
They could be, yes.
Okay, because I was under the impression when I first heard this that these were folks that maybe did this for a living, and that they basically were, that's why we call them independent, that they had some experience and they ran elections as opposed to being a member of a neighborhood council and then showing up to run someone else's election. Right.
No, these are folks that basically are experienced neighborhood council volunteers that have prior experience with elections. And so we've recruited them, and we conducted a number of outreach sessions and informational sessions. We also conducted interviews to make sure that they were qualified. But these are not any people with prior professional elections experience, if that was your
Yeah,
understanding.
that's what I thought when I heard,
Right.
I guess, just the title, that I thought they were independent of the process and that they were being brought in, that's what they kind of did, is they did elections as part of one of their tasks. The other thing I was wondering about on dealing with the elections, when we talk about selecting people that have experience, how varied is that going to be in the sense of representation of different parts of the city?
We've made sure that we reached out to all parts of the city, and while we are being careful to make sure that there isn't any potential conflict of interest with these IEAs working in their neighborhood council, because we're making sure that even though they may participate with the neighborhood council in a particular region, they're not the IEA for that region. But yes, I am making sure that the diversity and the familiarity of these people with the local concerns and issues are reflective of the community. Describe the regional model approach to conducting elections and propose staff to be allocated by region duties and expense. So we'll be conducting 12 regional elections between August and November, and each region will be comprised of anywhere between 6 and 10 neighborhood councils. They'll all be conducting elections on the same day within each region, and an IEA will be assigned to work with each neighborhood council region. And as I mentioned before, they're basically staffing the region from A through Z. So from the beginning of when the timeline starts to the day of election and post-elections, each region will be assisted by an IEA, and a lot of hand-holding will take place. Each region will vary in terms of their level of volunteer expertise and the number of volunteers that will be available. So again, we need the staffing to be able to adjust to the varying capacities of each region. And the duties and expense of conducting regional elections are detailed in our response to question number 3 above. How will the grievance, question number 8, how will the grievance and election challenge programs be implemented and at what cost? This is going to be, for the department anyway, a new way to handle the challenge process. And the overall challenge process is described in page 21 of the elections manual. And the basic procedures and the steps are that a written request will be submitted to the department no less than 5 calendar days after the election. Staff will do a vetting of the request to make sure that it meets certain eligibility criteria. We want to make sure that basically challenges that are issued because you lost an election is not heard through this process. It has to be a viable, and we'll be enumerating. We have enumerated in the challenge process certain criteria that have to be met before it will be heard through the challenge process.
So that would primarily be challenges on the administrative issues, and then also whether they're ballots or
Right, procedural. Yes.
Okay.
I've reached out to the city's Employee Relations Board, who has a list of pre-qualified professionals who are arbitrators. And so we are working with them to identify qualified arbitrators that will be on fee. We'll basically be paying them a per diem. Based on their experience, they feel that if for elections purposes, that they could hear anywhere between 2 and 3 challenges a day. So their decisions will be final, and the department will basically implement what their final findings are. In addition to ERB, we have a number of temporary vendors who also have the ability to bring on arbiters, so we'll be also relying on them as a source as well. We're unable to, at this time, to project the total number of challenges. I believe the city clerk heard 13 challenges when they held them in 2010. And we've also included, at your request, a copy of the city clerk's grievance procedure. Describe your hiring plan. Question number 9. The exempt project coordinators, we have currently a job announcement listed with the Center for Nonprofit Management. We'll also be recruiting through the neighborhood council system as well for eligible staffing. Again, our timeline is to bring on these folks July 1st. The as-needed positions, we'll also be working with the city clerk's office and the personnel department to advertise for those positions. We'll be looking for relevant experience there to help with the staffing of the elections as well as the day of. The independent election administrators and back office support will be hired through a combination of the as-needed as well as the temporary staffing services. The back office support is really to take care of as much of the administrative work with the elections as possible, because my goal is to free up the volunteer time to focus on outreach. So the board members' principal jobs are to recruit for candidates and voters, with really the lead strategy being relying on the candidates to generate the votes. So that's why it's important for us to try to nudge the neighborhood councils to create as many competitive seats as possible, because then you have a dog in the fight and you're going to go out and try to beat the other candidate. But if you go unchallenged, there's no incentive for them to do any outreach whatsoever. I think in the city clerk's elections, they also found that competitive candidates, board open seats, was the major driver for votes. Question number 10, describe done in the departments and neighborhood councils outreach efforts and how costs will be allocated. As I mentioned before, the department will make every effort to utilize low and no-cost avenues to promote the elections, such as the city's Channel 35, mayor and council websites, and public service announcements. We are conducting our own citywide outreach efforts with the $10,000 that I mentioned earlier. In addition to that, we're conducting 25 live workshops throughout the city, and using our communications ability, we've really reached out to a wide range of neighborhood councils throughout the city. The idea is to get them interested in the work of neighborhood councils, not necessarily becoming a board member, but to say that, you know, getting your community's voice heard is really the main motivating force for wanting to be a board member, and that message. And the workshops have a number of different kinds of content, including how you use social media, how to improve your communication skills, your public presentation skills, consensus building, and a number of skills that are needed to be an effective neighborhood council board member. We also create outreach templates for neighborhood councils. So, for example, we created a brochure that neighborhood councils could basically use as a plug-and-play approach. They can just stamp their name on it and pretty much use those to conduct outreach. And going on to question number 11, describe the translation services to be offered and cost estimates. All the following documents will be translated into Spanish, made available to neighborhood councils. Those include candidate filing forms, stakeholder registration forms, vote by mail, applications, vote by mail voting instructions, at polls voting instructions. Additional language to be offered include Korean, Armenian, and Chinese. These languages were picked based on past usage patterns of neighborhood councils. Additional training materials for poll workers must also be translated, and we put an estimated cost of $33,750. We also need translators for the training workshops. So this is live translation, and the costs range there between $250 to $350 per session. And we projected that about 140 sessions would be needed at a rough price tag of $49,000. The department is also requesting translation equipment be purchased. So this is simultaneous translation equipment. This is something that's pretty widely used for neighborhood councils, particularly in those neighborhood councils in those areas that have a large number of limited English-speaking stakeholders. An estimated cost there is $17,500 for 5 machines. What is the process necessary for changing neighborhood council bylaws? Basically, they submit their application to us, and after passing a board resolution, there's a certain window by which we allow neighborhood councils to change their bylaws, after which we go dark so that we can implement the elections, and then we'll open them up again. But mostly, bylaws changes are what we've been focusing on is the bylaws changes necessary in order for us to conduct the elections.
And all those would be in place before the August 1st election?
Yes, Bracy's been mainly managing the bylaws, but the bylaws has been complemented by what we're calling the stipulation worksheet, and that contains all of the decisions that neighborhood councils need to make to conduct the elections, like location, date, hours, documentation requirements for the voters, what are the minimum age for voters, and then whether they want vote by mail or not.
Now, will we provide them a format or a template for that language?
Yes, we do. And then question 13 is, what are the criteria to be used to select the arbitrators? Again, we're relying on the city's ERB list, and they have a range of arbiters with various levels of qualifications, and we're focusing on the ones that are not as highly skilled, since we don't believe that the qualifications will be as stringent as some of the legal issues that they have to handle in terms of employee challenges. And then lastly, we have an administrative request for a motion from this committee to enumerate the as-needed positions so that we can hire them, and they're listed in our report. That there are a number of positions, including election assistant 1, 2, 3, and 4, election clerk, clerk typist, senior election assistant, student professional worker, and admin intern, and the per hour pay ranges are also enumerated, and we request that you introduce this motion so that we can hire these positions for the elections. And that concludes my report.
Yes, Cecilia, on having a committee report come out, would that address these as-needed positions?
Yeah, you could do that. Well, you're going to continue this item to July, right? You could do I think Richard could do a committee report saying, for this particular item, you can move that forward.
Move these as-needed
Yeah.
positions for the August
Yeah.
election? All right. Let me just ask a couple other questions.
Or you could do it by motion on yourself.
Okay, whatever's easiest then first.
Yeah.
Okay. And we rely on the CLACO to give us direction on that best. So the thing that I think is important in this report, whenever we approve it out of this committee, that we give people as a comprehensive report that they can take in one place and go through it and review it. And so the other thing that it appears that we have little or no leeway on is the timeline. We have to get this done before November and starting in August. So there's no real change there. The bylaws concern me that that we have 95 plus bylaws have to be completed before the August elections, and we feel certain we can get that done.
Yes, we do. We've actually, timing-wise, we've benefited because the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners adopted a standardized budget bylaws template about a year ago. And so we've actually been working on improving bylaws system-wide prior to this election. So that was timely precursor to the bylaws adjustments that needed to be made for the election.
And then where are we on, I think last couple of meetings we talked about having you and ITA and the CLACO meet about the department's web page, because that's going to be a vehicle also for outreach and understanding of the process.
We've actually constructed a temporary website that, for purposes of providing an administrative and communications platform for the elections. So that's a temporary kind of website that we're using mainly for the elections. And then once we have meetings with ITA to figure out what kind of assistance they could provide us to develop something that's more in line with the citywide policies and procedures. Initial meetings have indicated that ITA has limited capacity to provide the department with assistance for website construction and maintenance, but we'll continue to have meetings. We're also I just initiated a meeting with ITA and CLA to discuss the issue of whether the city could provide emails for each individual neighborhood council board member, and probably by the July meeting I could provide an update with you, and you may possibly want to invite ITA to update on that issue as well.
Okay. Now, when you say a temporary web page, it's under the same link? As
Yes,
the current?
it's the same URL.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So it's accessible. If folks click to empowerla.org, they will see the new website that's being used for the elections.
What is it again?
empowerla.org. And I think what you'll find there is a much easier and user-friendly format for people to find information.
But I mean, if people that are used to going on the website, this is the same.
Yes.
Okay. Then the other thing, will they have access to where this report will be a link that they
That will
can
be included in the
download?
website as well. Yes.
I think we covered all the things. The issue, and I think all those things that asked you to look at the outreach to make sure that we're in coordination with the, like you said, the council offices, the 95 neighborhood councils, so that we're not overly outreaching an area or tripping over each other and having nothing in other areas, that is as wide-ranging as we can ensure, and the coordination, because that's going to be the big issue, and
Right.
maybe the area that cuts down on grievances when it's all over.
That's right. And I couldn't agree more with your emphasis on outreach for the system overall. I think that's probably been the most, the biggest Achilles heel in the system. And it's something actually neighborhood councils overwhelmingly responded as the #1 priority to a survey that I issued about 2 years ago. They said #1, it was really the need for the city to help neighborhood councils with outreach and raising the volume on the fact that neighborhood councils are here to serve you, and you need to get involved in order to make a difference for your community. So,
Well, council officers should expect a letter from you asking that these important dates be put on their webpage.
right, along with the message and the messaging and the information that they would need as well.
Okay. Let me ask, CAO have anything to add on?
No, at this point, Councilmember, we don't, but it would be probably beneficial for our office to be included in any meetings with ITA relative to any new systems because of the potential cost impact and the impact on the city's budget.
Yeah. And I think the key there is anything that may get implemented, if there's a ongoing cost or something to that nature, we'd have to be aware of it. So,
Yes.
and again, I would ask that before we have our July meeting, that we ask CAO, CLA, and the department head to meet with ITA and talk about this email, the webpage, and any assistance they can give in outreach of Channel 35 and all the other things to ensure that we get as much information out on elections as possible during that concentrated period. So, and then what our expectation for July would be, the CLA, CAO is going to have a joint report about the June 4th report and come back with their recommendations. If there are changes, again, I'd really like to, as much as we can, have all the information in the department report, so they're not, the individual neighborhood councils are not dealing with the committee report and then the CLA report and then the whatever. We could put as much information in one document. And again, I think it's helpful that we are looking at the guidance given by the city clerk in their prior elections that people should be pretty familiar with. So that's the kind of thing we want to make sure of, because the last thing we need is start in August and people are confused as to what they should or shouldn't be doing. So,
Mr. Chair, I just needed to clarify in terms of what you're requesting from the department beyond the 2012 election manual and your request to develop a place where neighborhood councils can find all the information in one place.
that's what this document
Is this, yeah, does this satisfy your?
I think that it satisfies, but I want to make sure that the CLA CEO looks at this, and if there's some additions that, you know, that I haven't thought about, they have something like 11 or 12 questions, that we can find a way to alter the June 4th report to make sure everything is in one place. And I think that's what we're striving for.
Okay.
Okay?
And then lastly, if I could request the motion for the as-needed.
We will get the CLA and CAO to put that together, where it's a motion or committee report or whatever is the best way to facilitate it. We'll
Because
get
we
that.
will need those positions in place for the July 1st,
Oh, no, we'll get that done.
staffing up.
We'll get a motion. We'll work on it.
Pardon me, Mr. Chair. City Clerk, in order to move any item forward in a committee report, the committee would have to, or the chair would have to issue a communication approving some action on this item.
I think we'll prepare the motion
just
for
do
your
a separate
signature.
motion?
A separate motion. Not the
That
committee.
way- But the separate motion will encompass the recommendations as to the as-needed positions. Okay? Because it's already in the budget, right?
Mr. Chairman, there is funding in the budget for the neighborhood council elections. The only concern that we would have is in reviewing the list, making sure that these are already existing as needed positions, and so there's not anything that requires additional action from the personnel department. So to the extent that these positions are already existing, they can probably be included in the motion and with instructions to the necessary offices to do.
But when we get that motion, it should cover all of that.
Yes, we will work with the CLA to make sure that that's in place.
Okay. So we can depend on that, and then we'll set up a meeting, a special meeting in July, that we will avoid the recess so that we can get this approved before the August election. And then one of the final thing I want to comment on item one, when we talk about the issue of funds, for those, I think we also have to, gave you two other issues to think about, but the third one would be if the neighborhood councils have already, I think we need a determination of whether those funds should come from a 12-13 budget as opposed to tampering what's already been allocated in the current year budget. So we're not unraveling something that's already been proposed. Okay? All right, any other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let me ask somebody, those that put cards in, did we cover your questions? Not necessarily you agree, but did we cover your questions? Anybody? Okay, thank you very much for adjourning.
Yeah, you're good.